When Ben, a decorated veteran, wanted to enter the plane, something unexpected happened. He realized that he had lost his ticket, and the airplane staff refused to let him board. Ben could not believe that this was happening. He had just shown his ticket to them minutes ago, but still, they refused to let him in. But luckily, Ben knew a different way to get in. He only had to make one phone call. Ben confusedly looked up at the boarding agent. Was this really happening? He thought he had misheard the woman at first, but soon enough, she repeated herself, and Ben could clearly hear what the boarding agent was telling him. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." "Excuse me?" he asked, but the flight attendant simply ignored him and turned to the next person in line. Ben could not believe that this was really happening right now. He needed to get on that plane no matter what, and he would do whatever he needed to make that happen. Ben understood that none of the staff were going to help him, so he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Not much later, he was finally sitting in his seat on the plane with a big smile on his face. The staff turned pale when finding out who he had called. But who did Ben call? How was he able to get on the plane after all? And why did the crew turn pale? Ben had been invited to attend a special ceremony in the country where he once served, honoring veterans like himself. The government had generously provided him with a business-class ticket, acknowledging his sacrifices and contributions. This journey was a rare opportunity for Ben to reconnect with his past, but the trip would go a lot differently than he imagined. Because of the business-class upgrade, Ben was quite excited about flying. He knew he would be well taken care of and figured the staff would be a bit nicer to him because of his uniform as well. But sadly, nothing could have prepared him for how the staff was actually going to treat him. On the day of his flight, Ben made sure to double-check everything. After making sure he had his passport, plane ticket, and luggage ready, he hopped in a taxi and drove to the airport. When he arrived, he dropped off his luggage and went to sit in the lounge. For a while, it seemed like everything was going to proceed smoothly. After being treated royally the whole day by the taxi driver and the staff in the VIP lounge, Ben expected to receive the same treatment on the plane. He had a ticket for a business-class seat, after all. So when it was time for boarding, Ben was one of the first passengers in line, and he expected to be in his seat very quickly. But it soon became clear that it would not be as easy as he had hoped. The boarding agent asked to see Ben's passport, and he happily showed it to her. "Your boarding pass, please," she said, and Ben chuckled when he realized that he had forgotten to take it out of his bag. "Of course, just a moment, please. Let me find it." But when he checked his bag, the boarding pass wasn't there. He was convinced that that was where he had left it. And he could have sworn that he had the boarding pass in his hands just a few minutes ago, so where could it be? He checked the pockets of his pants and jacket, but those were empty too. Ben smiled kindly at the boarding agent and told her, "I can't seem to find it right now," thinking she would let him board anyway, since he had already needed to scan his boarding pass to check in. But this did not happen. The boarding agent didn't even smile back at Ben or try to hide her displeasure. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Ben was stunned. Was she being serious? "But I have to get on this flight," Ben said as he searched his bag again. "I swear it was right here," Ben said. But the boarding agent impatiently tapped her foot on the ground. She stood there, arms crossed, looking down at Ben, who was confused by this whole situation. Everyone around them had gotten quiet, and the others waiting in line were trying to eavesdrop on the conversation. "Sir, you're holding up the rest. Either you leave now, willingly, or we'll have to call the police," the boarding agent suddenly demanded. "Please, you have to believe me. I have a seat on that plane." Ben tried to plead with her, but nothing seemed to work. Ben looked around, and he could not believe that this was really happening. Everyone was aware of what was going on, but no one stepped in to help, not even the other boarding agents. Ben felt helpless. This was nothing like he imagined his trip would be. He really didn't want to miss the ceremony. This was a complete disaster. "Sir?" the boarding agent asked again. Her tone became more annoyed each time she had to speak to Ben. Ben didn't know what to do. If he were to do what the agent asked him to, would he be able to get on the next plane? He'd probably be late for the ceremony anyway. But also, why would he even oblige? His host had paid for his ticket, and he deserved to be in that seat. With each passing minute, the boarding agent got more and more annoyed, and she wasn't the only one, for the other passengers were sighing and groaning in annoyance as well. As far as they knew, Ben was in the wrong for refusing to leave, and they were not trying to hide their frustration. "Just leave already, old man," someone suddenly yelled. Ben stood before the boarding agent, his heart pounding in his chest. "I assure you, I had my ticket," he pleaded. The agent's expression remained stern and unyielding. "No ticket? No boarding," she replied firmly. Ben's hands trembled slightly, his mind racing for a solution. The agent's eyes, devoid of sympathy, seemed to look right through him. Ben felt a wave of frustration, but kept his composure, clinging to hope. Around Ben, a crowd of passengers began to form, their expressions a mix of curiosity and impatience. Whispers filled the air, and occasional glances were thrown in his direction. Ben could feel their eyes on him. Each looked like a weight adding to his burden. The murmurs grew louder, a chorus of impatience, as the line behind him lengthened. Ben felt exposed and vulnerable, standing at the center of growing unrest. Ben rummaged through his bag again, his fingers clumsily searching every pocket and crevice. "It must be here," he muttered to himself. His search became more frantic, each empty pocket fueling his growing despair. The boarding pass, his golden ticket to the ceremony, seemed to have vanished into thin air. With each passing second, his hope of finding it dwindled, leaving him with a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. Confusion and frustration clouded Ben's thoughts. He had been through battles, faced life-threatening situations, but nothing had prepared him for this helpless feeling. "I served this country," he thought, the irony of his situation not lost on him. The boarding agent's cold demeanor only added to his distress. Why won't they understand? He wondered silently, feeling a mix of anger and helplessness wash over him. Realizing his continued presence was only escalating the situation, Ben stepped aside. His movements were slow, weighed down by disbelief and disappointment. He glanced back at the boarding agent, hoping for a change of heart, but was met with the same indifferent gaze. The murmurs of the crowd followed him, their words echoing in his ears. Ben stood to the side, his mind reeling, as the reality of the situation began to sink in. As the last of the passengers disappeared down the jetway, a stark realization hit Ben. He watched, feeling a sense of urgency rising within him. The final boarding call echoed through the terminal, a sound that seemed to quicken his heartbeat. "I can't just stand here," he thought, his eyes fixed on the diminishing line. The gate was closing, and with it, his chances of making the flight and the ceremony. With a deep breath, Ben reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. It was his last hope, a lifeline in a sea of uncertainty. He scrolled through his contacts, each name a reminder of his past connections and experiences. His finger hovered over a number, his mind racing with possibilities. Making this call could change everything, he knew. With a resolute click, he made his decision. Ben pressed the phone to his ear, his expression hardened with determination. The dial tone sounded in his ear, a rhythmic beacon amidst the chaos of the airport. His gaze was fixed, staring off into the distance as he waited for the call to connect. In that moment, he was a portrait of resolve, his face etched with the lines of a man ready to confront his fate. The line connected, and Ben spoke with urgency, his voice low and firm. "I need your help," he began, his words rushing out. The response on the other end was inaudible, but Ben's reactions spoke volumes. He nodded, his eyes closing briefly in what seemed like relief, or perhaps gratitude. The conversation was brief, the details obscured, but the gravity of his situation hung in every word. As Ben ended the call, he pocketed his phone and looked towards the gate. The last passenger had boarded, and the door was beginning to close. He stood there, a solitary figure amidst the bustle of the terminal, clinging to a sliver of hope. His face showed a mix of anxiety and expectation, a man on the brink of resolution. He waited, each second stretching out, hanging on to the hope that his call had made a difference. Ben's voice was a low murmur, his conversation barely audible amid the terminal's hum. He spoke with measured words, each sentence carefully crafted. His eyes darted around, ensuring privacy in this public space. "I need your help," he reiterated, a note of urgency creeping into his voice. He listened intently, nodding occasionally, his expression a mix of hope and anxiety. It was a discreet exchange, but one laden with importance. The boarding agent, previously indifferent, now watched Ben with a sharpened curiosity. His serious tone and focused demeanor had piqued her interest. She tried to mask her suspicion with a veneer of professionalism, but her eyes betrayed a growing intrigue. From her post, she observed Ben closely, trying to piece together the nature of his urgent call. It was clear that this was no ordinary conversation, and it had captured her full attention. Nearby passengers and staff, having witnessed Ben's urgent call, began to whisper among themselves. "Who could he be talking to?" someone murmured. Their curiosity was palpable, their speculations ranging from the mundane to the dramatic. Each whispered theory added to the growing atmosphere of intrigue surrounding Ben. The mystery of his phone call had unwittingly turned him into a figure of interest, a source of airport gossip and conjecture. As Ben's call drew to a close, his voice grew more earnest. "Please, I need this," he implored, a note of desperation creeping in. The line went silent for a moment, and Ben held his breath. He glanced anxiously at the boarding agent, then back at his phone. "Thank you," he whispered, a mixture of relief and apprehension in his voice. The call ended, leaving Ben in a state of hopeful anticipation. After ending the call, Ben's eyes immediately shifted to the large clock hanging above the gate. The minutes were slipping away, each one heightening his anxiety. He paced back and forth, his gaze constantly returning to the clock and then to the slowly closing gate. Time was his adversary now. Each tick of the clock, a reminder of the dwindling window for intervention. Ben's hope hung precariously in the balance, tethered to the hope of timely help. Ben stood rooted to the spot, his eyes locked on the slowly closing gate. The sounds of the airport seemed to fade into a distant hum as his focus narrowed. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a physical manifestation of his growing nervousness. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, a silent rhythm of anxiety. Each passing moment felt like an eternity, each movement of the gate a step towards despair. Despite the tension, Ben tried to ignore the boarding agent's increasingly hostile glares. Her eyes seemed to bore into him, filled with impatience and disdain. But Ben's gaze remained fixed on the gate, determined not to let her disapproval affect him. He stood his ground, his face a mask of calm amidst the storm of negativity surrounding him. In this moment, he needed all his resolve to stay hopeful against the rising tide of hostility. As the minutes ticked by, Ben felt his hope start to slip away. The gate was inching closer to being fully closed, each moment a nail in the coffin of his chances. He scanned the area, searching for any sign of intervention, but found none. His heart sank a little more with each passing second. The possibility of making the flight, once a beacon of hope, now seemed like a distant dream. Gradually, the area around the gate cleared, leaving Ben and the boarding agent in a silent standoff. The bustling crowd had moved on, their lives continuing unaffected by Ben's plight. He stood there, a solitary figure against the backdrop of an emptying gate. The agent checked her watch, her expression unchanging. Ben felt an overwhelming sense of isolation, as though he and the agent were the only two people in the world. The final countdown had begun. Ben's heart raced as he watched the gate begin its final closure. It felt like the closing of a chapter, a physical representation of his fading chances. His mind raced, thoughts jumbled and desperate. He glanced at the agent, who now seemed to be waiting for something, perhaps the inevitable conclusion of this ordeal. Ben's nervousness peaked, his body tensed for the outcome, whatever it might be. The air was thick with tension as Ben stood, his anxiety palpable. The boarding agent, clearly impatient, tapped her foot, her eyes darting between Ben and the nearly closed gate. The bustling sounds of the airport seemed to amplify the silence between them. Ben's breaths were shallow, his mind racing with the gravity of the moment. The agent's impatience was a stark contrast to Ben's anxious wait, heightening the stress of the ticking clock. In a last-ditch effort, Ben approached the agent once more. "Please, just a few more minutes," he pleaded, his voice tinged with desperation. His eyes conveyed the depth of his plea, a silent testament to his dire need. The agent, unmoved, merely glanced at her watch, her expression stoic. Ben's plea hung in the air, a fragile hope against the unyielding reality of the situation. The boarding agent, with a final glance at Ben, reached for her walkie-talkie. "Gate closing for Flight 217, she announced, her voice void of emotion. Ben watched in despair as she relayed the message, the finality of her words striking him like a physical blow. The sound of the gate locking into place echoed through the terminal, marking the end of his chances. The agent's actions were efficient, devoid of any acknowledgement of Ben's plight. As the realization set in, a wave of heartbreak washed over Ben. He wouldn't make the flight. He wouldn't be at the ceremony. His shoulders slumped, a physical manifestation of his defeat. His eyes, once filled with hope, now mirrored the loss he felt. The missed opportunity weighed heavily on him, each thought a reminder of what could have been. It was a profound disappointment, one that resonated deep within him. Ben stood motionless as the plane began to taxi away. He watched, disheartened, as it moved further and further from the gate, taking with it his last vestiges of hope. The sound of the engines roared in the distance, a somber soundtrack to his departure of hope. Ben's gaze lingered on the disappearing aircraft, his heart heavy with a sense of loss. The plane's departure was more than a physical journey. It was the embodiment of a missed connection, a lost chance. Just as the plane began to move, an airport employee hurried towards Ben and the agent. Ben's eyes widened in surprise, his heart skipping a beat. The employee's brisk pace and urgent expression indicated something unforeseen. Ben watched, a flicker of hope reigniting within him. The agent turned to face the employee, her expression of indifference giving way to curiosity. The unexpected arrival of the employee paused the finality of the moment. The employee leaned in, whispering something into the agent's ear. The words were inaudible, but their impact was immediate. The agent's rigid demeanor softened, her eyebrows rising in apparent surprise. Ben observed the exchange, a sense of cautious optimism growing within him. The whispers seemed to carry weight, altering the course of events. The tension that had gripped the air began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of unfolding change. The agent turned to Ben, her previously stern face now wearing a forced smile. "There's been a mix-up," she explained, her tone unexpectedly amiable. "You can board the plane." Ben's heart leaped at her words. The sudden shift from despair to opportunity was disorienting, yet exhilarating. He could hardly believe the turn of events. A moment ago, all had seemed lost, and now, unexpectedly, his path was clear. With a nod of gratitude to the employee, Ben quickly made his way to the boarding gate. His steps were light, a stark contrast to the heavy despair he had felt moments before. Confusion mingled with relief in his heart. He passed through the gate, each step taking him closer to his destination and away from the brink of disappointment. The once closed path was now open, welcoming him aboard at last. Ben settled into his seat, the only empty one on the plane. He felt the curious gazes of the other passengers but chose to ignore them, focusing instead on the relief of being on board. His mind replayed the day's tumultuous events as the plane taxied onto the runway. He leaned back, closing his eyes briefly. Despite the earlier ordeal, his journey was finally underway, carrying him towards the ceremony and the promise it held. Ben eased into his seat, feeling the soft cushion envelop him. He adjusted the headrest, settling in for the journey ahead. The events of the day replayed in his mind, a whirlwind of emotions and unexpected turns. He took a deep breath, allowing the comfort of his seat to ease the day's tension. The warmth of the cabin and the murmur of the engines provided a soothing backdrop as he began to relax. Suddenly, the pilot's voice filled the cabin, clear and warm over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special guest aboard today, veteran Ben, heading to a distinguished ceremony." Ben's eyes widened in surprise. The recognition was unexpected, bringing a flush of pride and humility. His fellow passengers turned towards him, their expressions changing from curiosity to respect. The pilot's welcome was a balm, soothing the earlier sting of the day's events. At the pilot's warm acknowledgement, a wave of relief washed over Ben. He smiled, feeling a sense of belonging and appreciation he hadn't felt in hours. The tension in his shoulders eased, and he leaned back, more comfortable now. The cabin's atmosphere shifted, the earlier stares of irritation replaced with nods of acknowledgement and smiles. Ben felt a renewed sense of purpose, his journey taking on a deeper meaning. The plane began its ascent, steadily climbing into the skies. Ben felt the gentle pushback in his seat as the aircraft soared upwards. He watched through the window as the ground fell away, the airport becoming a small patchwork below. The ascent was symbolic, lifting him not just physically, but also emotionally, away from the trials at the airport and towards new horizons. The sky ahead was clear, full of promise and potential. Ben gazed out the window, his eyes tracing the clouds as they drifted lazily by. His thoughts turned to the upcoming ceremony, a mix of anticipation and reflection filling him. The landscape below stretched out, a tapestry of life and memories. He thought about the ceremony, what it represented, and the honor it brought him. The journey ahead was not just a flight, but a passage to a moment of recognition and reverence. As the plane cruised at altitude, Ben's mind wandered to his years of service. Each cloud seemed to bring a different memory, a montage of his past experiences. He reflected on the sacrifices and the camaraderie, the challenges and the triumphs. The ceremony ahead felt like a culmination of all those years, a tangible recognition of his and others' dedication. His heart swelled with a mix of pride and nostalgia, his service a defining chapter of his life. Ben's mind continued to traverse the landscape of his military past. He remembered faces, some lost to time, others still vivid in his mind. Each memory was a thread in the fabric of his military life, weaving a story of resilience and duty. The quiet hum of the aircraft served as a backdrop to his reminiscing, each recollection a tribute to the journey he had undertaken, both in uniform and now as a veteran. As the flight neared its destination, Ben's anticipation for the ceremony grew. He imagined the gathering, the respect and recognition, the shared stories among fellow veterans. His heart began to beat faster, not with nervousness, but with eager excitement. The ceremony symbolized more than just his own service. It was a tribute to all who had served alongside him. The significance of the occasion filled him with a sense of purpose and honor. Ben started to prepare for landing, organizing his belongings and straightening up. His thoughts turned to the imminent arrival, the ceremony that awaited him. He rehearsed in his mind what he might say, how he would express his gratitude and pride. The announcement of the descent brought a new wave of realization. The ceremony, once a distant plan, was now just moments away. He braced himself, ready to embrace the moment that awaited. The plane touched down, the landing a gentle but firm conclusion to a journey marked by trials and tribulations. Ben felt a sense of accomplishment as the aircraft taxied to the gate. He looked out the window at the airport, a gateway to the next chapter of this extraordinary day. His journey, fraught with challenges, had brought him here to this moment of recognition and honor. The ceremony, a once distant goal, was now within reach. Ben stepped off the plane with a dignified poise, a renewed sense of purpose evident in his stride. The challenges of the day had not dampened his spirit, but rather fortified his resolve. As he walked through the jet bridge, each step was a testament to his perseverance. He felt a deep connection to his past service and the significance of the upcoming ceremony. This was more than just an arrival. It was a triumphant return. Upon arrival at the ceremony location, Ben was greeted with warm smiles and heartfelt handshakes. The welcome was a stark contrast to the day's earlier events, filling him with a sense of belonging and appreciation. Organizers and fellow attendees acknowledged his presence, their respect for his service clear in their eyes. This reception was a balm to the day's earlier trials, enveloping Ben in a community of shared respect and gratitude. The ceremony venue buzzed with the energy of reunited comrades. Ben mingled among fellow veterans, each interaction a thread reconnecting him to his past. They shared stories and laughter, the camaraderie timeless. Each anecdote, each shared memory, was a reminder of their shared experiences and sacrifices. This reconnection was not just about reminiscing, it was a celebration of their enduring bond, forged in the fires of service. As the evening settled in, Ben found a quiet corner to gather his thoughts. The excitement of the day gave way to contemplation as he prepared for his speech. He reflected on what he wanted to convey, the essence of his experience, and the message of gratitude and remembrance he wished to share. The quiet of the night provided a backdrop for his preparation, a moment of calm before the significance of the next day. In the solitude of the night, Ben reflected on the journey that had brought him here. It was not just the literal journey of the day, but the metaphorical journey of his life. The challenges, the moments of despair, and the triumphs all played a part in shaping him. As he pondered, the weight of the upcoming ceremony settled in. a culmination of a lifetime of service. The night was a canvas for his thoughts, painting a picture of a life marked by dedication and honor. The moment arrived for Ben to take the stage. With each step towards the podium, his heart swelled with a mix of pride and responsibility. The audience's attentive eyes were on him, their faces a tapestry of anticipation and respect. He adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and looked out over the crowd. This was his moment to share his story, to represent his fellow servicemen and women. The room hushed in anticipation. Ben began his speech, his voice steady and clear. He spoke of his time in service, of the bonds formed and the sacrifices made. His words were heartfelt, painting a vivid picture of the life of a soldier. He talked about the challenges, the triumphs, and the unbreakable spirit of those who serve. His speech resonated with the audience, touching the hearts of all present. It was a tribute to courage and commitment, delivered with genuine emotion. As his speech neared its end, Ben shared the story of his phone call. He revealed how an old friend, a high-ranking military officer, had come to his aid in a moment of need. The tale added a layer of humanity and vulnerability to his speech, illustrating the enduring bonds formed in service. The audience listened intently, moved by the display of loyalty and friendship that transcended time and rank. Ben concluded his speech, and the ceremony drew to a close with a powerful tribute to all veterans. There was a moment of collective reflection, honoring the sacrifices and valor of those who had served. The applause that followed was not just for Ben, but for every veteran present, a recognition of their shared legacy of service. As the ceremony ended, Ben felt a profound sense of fulfillment, his journey culminating in a fitting tribute to a life of service.